Welcome to part 4 of my series on the Hidden Kings written by Miles Mathis. For those of you who want to see episode 2, if you're on YouTube, I suggest that you go to my DTube channel, which I will link in the description, and watch all of my videos there, because YouTube has been making it very problematic for me to upload some of these videos. So if you want to see all of my videos, go to my DTube channel. So, episode 2 in the Hidden Kings, for some reason YouTube is not allowing it to be shown. I was checking on the restrictions and why. One of them said it was because of tags, another said that it was because of copyright material, so I don't know where they're getting all this nonsense from. But if you want to see all of my videos, go to my DTube channel. I also have a BitChute channel, which I will also put below, so those are my other channels that I've been uploading my videos on, and if I add anything more to that, I'll let you know. But if you want to see episode 2, and there's another video that YouTube did not allow me to upload called Hollywood's Child Molesting Robot, I would also suggest that people go to my DTube channel and find that video as well, because it is it breaks down a Saturday Night Live skit that is very disturbing, and I'll just leave it at that. But anyway, let's get right back into the Hidden Kings, where we left off in part 3. With all this in mind, you may wish to reconsider all the alternate theories of RFK's alleged death. Many are still pushing the alternative theory that Sirhan was a Manchurian candidate programmed to kill. We also have new evidence of 13 shots fired, when Sirhan's gun only contained 8. You see how they misdirect you into new controversies, but all controversies, old and new, still contain the same final story. Bobby was killed. They don't really care if you believe there was a conspiracy or not. They only care that you accept the ending. They are quite happy that these controversies are still aired, since the controversies act to cover the truth. If you are thinking about the number of shots or Manchurian candidates, you are not thinking about how the photographs were faked, and about how we have no proof of a murder to start with. The government can certainly create hypnotized murderers, but it has no need to in cases like this. When no one is murdered, you don't need a hypnotized murderer. As Jack was the real power behind Lyndon, Bobby was the real power behind Dick. At that time, Nixon couldn't have won any election he wasn't given. The 1968 election was a gift from the Kennedys. Doubters will say, why didn't the Kennedys make Humphrey their frontman instead of Nixon? The Kennedys hated Nixon. 1. There is no evidence the Kennedys hated Nixon. They wanted to beat him in 1960, but that is not hatred, that is ambition. Nixon was a better man to do their dirty work in 1968. They wanted to continue the Vietnam War, and Nixon was a better scapegoat for this than Humphrey. It was easy to sell the idea that RFK was against the war and Nixon was for it, although this was false. The Kennedys were never against the war. They used the Cold War and the Vietnam War just like Bush and Cheney did using 9/11 and the wars in the Middle East. These wars drove the military and intelligence economies and made them and their friends richer. 2. It was time for the Republicans to get the presidency. People assume that the Republicans and Democrats are adversaries, but they aren't. They are allies. Some people are beginning to accept this. Clued in first by Ralph Nader in the late 1990s, and now clued in by the total capitulation of a Democratic Congress to the neocon agenda, including the loss of habeas corpus, the shredding of the Constitution, and impending martial law. But it didn't just happen in the 90s or after 9/11, it has been true throughout the 20th century. Did FDR overthrow the Federal Reserve and turn the entire government on its head? No, he continued the policies before him, with only subtle changes. He looked for the earliest possible entry into every war, as had his predecessors, Republican or Democrat, and even used tricks like Pearl Harbor to get them involved in the war. Then we have Truman unnecessarily bombing Japan, and of course Eisenhower, the ex-general of the army. We pretend that Eisenhower was warning Kennedy of the military-industrial complex with his famous speech, but that has been misread just like Kennedy's speech. Eisenhower was not warning Kennedy or anyone else, he was misdirecting. The bankers happened to need some misdirection in 1960, with Kennedy coming in, and they preferred that their eyes be on the Pentagon rather than on Wall Street or the Federal Reserve. He also needed to keep your eyes off the CIA. Why say military-industrial complex when CIA is much shorter? The CIA had already taken over the US government in the 1950s, and Eisenhower was fully aware of it. So that is how Eisenhower's quote should be read. We still get that kind of misdirection all the time. The Pentagon is perfectly willing to play the part of the decoy, since that is one of its central roles. It is just a tool of power, but most people forget that. It isn't the military that is the danger, it is the people that are controlling the military that are the danger. If we look at Nixon's presidency, we find many more clues. Remember when Nixon ordered the FBI to back off investigating Watergate and specifically White House tapes and correspondence? He said they should do so because of that Bay of Pigs thing. That quote is taken straight from the Wikipedia page, so it is no obscure quote. It is published there despite the fact that the Nixon page at Wiki is a whitewash. No one has yet analyzed that quote in the correct way. You should see that Bay of Pigs thing is shorthand for Kennedy. That is the code word for Kennedy. Nixon is telling the CIA and FBI that he should not be investigated since any investigation would jeopardize the Kennedy cover-up. It may be a threat to squeal, or it may be simply a warning that the White House correspondence is not clear of references to the big secret. Another important letter confirms this reading. The letter from James McCord to Richard Helms, revealed in Watergate hearings, says, quote, "Nixon and his boys pushed us to the brink, but they're backing away now and the danger has passed. Every tree in the forest in the last 10 years would have fallen and the earth scorched." End quote. No one has ever been able to make sense of that letter. What should you notice is the 10 years part of that quote. This letter was written in 1973, so 10 years would take us back to 1963. Again, Nixon and his boys were threatening to squeal about the faked assassination, which would indeed have scorched the earth. We can only imagine that the CIA either threatened Nixon with a real gun or convinced him this would bring down the whole republic, relying on his patriotism. I suspect the former. More suggestion of this is included in the White House tapes that have come down to us. The famous 18.5-minute gap has never been explained, but it is clear that something was erased from that tape that was more important than the evidence left on the tape, which was enough to impeach a president. Why would the tapes be saved and handed over to a subpoena? Why wasn't the whole set of tapes erased or destroyed, as is now the common practice in the Bush administration? Once again, Nixon was only the fall guy. Someone more powerful than Nixon used the tapes against Nixon. That is the only reason we would have them now. But something on the tape did more than sacrifice Nixon. Nixon mentioned Kennedy as a living person on the tape, and that is why we still have 18.5 minutes of mystery there. Also ask yourself why Nixon would tape himself, leaving such obvious evidence. The answer, he didn't. Nixon wasn't taping himself. He was being taped by the Kennedys as a precaution. Nixon was being monitored from above just as you are monitored from above at your workplace. Do we know of any previous presidents who had a complete set of tapes of their private conversations? Don't you think it is odd that Nixon would provide us with evidence of his own wrongdoings? Again, he was being monitored by the shadow government, and the tapes were meant to be a form of coercion. That is the only logical explanation for the existence of the tapes. Concerning Nixon, we must also remember that the Kennedys had a backup plan, one that they ended up using. That plan was Gerald Ford. If Nixon got uppity, they could just toss him in the bin and replace him with their lapdog Ford. Remember that Ford was on the Warren Commission. He had been doing the Kennedys' bidding from the beginning, though from the Republican Party. People assume that Ford was covering for someone else on the Warren Commission, but it wouldn't have been Johnson and it wouldn't have been Nixon, since Nixon is one of the few major players who has not been tied to the assassination. No, the turn of the screw here is that the Warren Commission was controlled by the Kennedys, by Jack Kennedy himself. Even Dulles was chosen to be on the Warren Commission by Jack himself. Why? Because in this way, he achieved a final reconciliation with Dulles, who he now had further use for, and he deflected any last suspicion that the Kennedys were involved in anything in Washington. Further confirmation of all of this is that Bobby Kennedy was still Attorney General in 1964. A lot of people forget that. Most people fail to study what Bobby did in 1964. If anyone thinks about it all, they tend to assume that he was scared to death and kept quiet from fear. That is an illogical assumption to make, since a man living in fear would not have immediately run for senator in 1964 and president in 1968. Bobby was not afraid of anything and never acted like he was for a moment. And yet he took no interest in the Warren Commission or any of the investigations. Since he was Attorney General at the time, this is doubly and triply strange if you believe the standard or alternate models. A man who was capable of speaking out on civil rights, a man who was capable of planning covert operations, a man who was capable of running for president, should have been capable of taking an interest in his brother's murder. It is obvious that he had a pulpit to do so like no one else ever had. The ovation given to him at the 1964 convention was proof of that, if he needed it. But I don't think he needed it. He had nothing to say, and the reason he had nothing to say is that Jack was still alive. How do you investigate the murder of a man who is still alive? How do you quibble with a Warren Commission that was set up to blow fairy dust? You don't. You just dodge the issue, and that is precisely what Bobby did. In the Boston Globe in 1998, Max Holland suggested that Bobby was suffering not from fear, but from guilt, in an argument that reads like pure disinformation, probably written by the CIA itself. Holland tells us Bobby was guilty because the murderers had copied a plan that he himself had drawn up for murdering Castro. Holland promises us proof of that assertion, but never delivers it. Instead, bookending this one-line bald assertion with other bald assertions. He leads his argument by telling us that he got his idea from records, then being released by the Assassinations Records Review Board. We are supposed to believe that this Assassinations Record Review Board was going to make public every significant artifact and document related to November 22nd, 1963 and its aftermath. Over 4 million documents. This is so that reason may prevail over paranoia. What that has to do with Bobby's guilt, we are not sure, but Holland needed to get it in there somewhere. Then we have the sentence about Bobby's guilt, tied only to the title of the article, and then we move quickly into another story, about Ford and Kissinger in 1975 when the CIA was in some hot water. Kissinger is quoted as saying that Bobby personally managed the Castro plot, and that because of this, the CIA is in fear for its existence. You will end up with a CIA that does only reporting and not operations, says Kissinger, according to Holland. Two things to point out here. One, Bobby was not in the CIA, so how does Bobby's conduct, whatever it was, endanger the CIA? Two, the CIA was in no more danger in 1975 than it is now. Holland's entire article has been cooked up to rewrite history. It has nothing to do with Bobby's guilt, and everything to do with convincing readers of the Globe that all assassination documents were released in 1998, and that the CIA was and is hanging by a shoestring for its existence in this cruel world. No, Bobby was not guilty any more than he was afraid. Bobby had nothing to say about the Warren Commission and almost nothing to say about the assassination because there was no assassination. Since 1963, the Democrats and Republicans have taken turns, almost like clockwork, pretending to run the country. We are told that this is due to the voters' tendency to throw the bums out. But the voters don't have any tendency, since everything they do is either completely scripted or completely ignored. The real reason the two parties have switched every 8 years or so is that this is part of the deal. The parties don't care, they don't ask, and they don't tell. Not about kings, and not about anything else, as long as they get a piece of the pie. This should now be clear. We can see that the parties and the major players in Congress and elsewhere don't care about any shadow government, not by the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, the Federal Reserve, the CFR, the Bilderbergers, the Trilateral Commission, or anyone else. If they don't care about the shadow governments we know we have, why should we be surprised to find that the parties don't care about shadow governments we don't know we have? If they aren't concerned about the CIA running amok, why should we be surprised to find that they don't care about an underground king? Many were surprised that the Democrats did little or nothing to get rid of the computers after the computers stole 2 presidential elections from them in 2000 and 2004. But the Democrats had no interest in getting rid of the computers or any other election-stealing device. 1, because the elections were rigged with the knowledge and connivance of the Democrats to start with, it wasn't their turn. 2, the Democrats looked forward to using the election-stealing devices in 2008, which they did. You might also want to remind yourself what kind of presidents we have had since Nixon. Ford, the non-entity, ruled by his Rockefeller vice president. Carter, the peanut butter farmer who came out of nowhere. Reagan, the actor. Bush, his sniveling VP and ex-CIA director. Clinton, the snake oil salesman from Arkansas. Bush Jr., the monkey in a suit. It was not a coincidence that all of them were mainly actors. As Sting said in a song, they all look like game show hosts to me. This was not true before Nixon. Why was it true after Nixon? It is because the presidency had by then become only a front. Johnson and Nixon had taken the part semi-seriously. They had tried to slake their ambition in an old-fashioned way, despite knowing that everything had changed. But after Nixon was taken down, the presidency was only an empty charade, and everyone knew that. It was an opportunity for sleeping with Ford, for grinning and shucking with Carter, and for posing on horses for Reagan. After Reagan, the position became standardized. It was just a series of photo ops and canned teleprompter speeches aboard aircraft carriers and on ranches, such as any circus barker could have done. Everyone knew that there must be someone behind this cardboard cutout, someone capable of making real decisions. Half-heartedly, we have thought to ourselves that maybe it was Hoover, or Kissinger, or Greenspan, or Cheney, as the case may be, but we have never felt satisfied by this. In this void, the other conspiracy theories set themselves up, from secret commissions to the CFR to alien oversight. How much more simple and rational is it now that we see the truth? Many of us had wanted a king, a Camelot, and we have been granted that wish. The Lady of the Lake came up from Hollywood carrying the sword Excalibur in the sheath of secrecy, and the Kennedys retreated to the confines of Avalon, ruling us from beneath the waves with a sorcery worthy of Merlin. We know we have shadow governments. Even the conspiracy theorists take Kennedy's own word for it, quoting him in 1,000 places. So how is it shocking to discover that the Kennedys were, and still are, this shadow government? What is most shocking, perhaps, is how obvious and logical the discovery actually is. A Congress that would accept 9/11 false flag operations, military tribunals acts, Patriot Acts, Homeland Security Acts named after Hitler's own acts, loss of habeas corpus, and so on, would hardly stick at having a king, would they? Another fact that confirms this is that Clinton always leaned toward the conspiracy theories before he became president. He didn't believe the Warren Commission. Suddenly, once he was president, he changed his mind. Why? He was briefed. Once you actually meet a dead Kennedy, it is hard to maintain a conspiracy theory about his death. Once you get a call from the king, it is difficult to maintain his assassination one way or the other. Noam Chomsky's recent comments fit in here as well. Why does Chomsky think the Kennedy assassinations are unimportant? Why does he hold that there were no important policy changes from Kennedy to Johnson? First, he knows that Kennedy was not against the Vietnam War. Second, he knows that there was no policy change since there was no change. There was no Kennedy to Johnson. There was only Kennedy, and Chomsky knows this. But he cannot just come out and say it. The Kennedys have given him the freedom to say whatever else he wants to. Since he is an intellectual, his audience will never exceed 3% of the population. But he cannot tell what he knows about Kennedy. Still, the implication slips out occasionally when he belittles the JFK conspiracy theorists. Only someone who knew that Kennedy was never killed could dismiss the murder with such casual contempt. The same may also be true of Alexander Cockburn. Cockburn is not the sort to accept the Warren Commission. It is possible he has met some of the dead Kennedys, and so is in an uncommon position on this topic. You also have to remember that Cockburn trashed Deborah Davis's book, Catherine the Great, in the Village Voice in 1979, probably at the behest of the CIA. Need more? How about the fact that one of the little-known losses of the World Trade Center demolitions is the loss of all the negatives of Kennedy's own photographer, Jock Lowe? The entire archive, over 40,000 frames, was lost at World Trade Center Building 5. According to the Lowe family, less than 400 of the frames have been printed in books and elsewhere. Not only that, but once again they were lost under mysterious circumstances. The bank that owned the vaults at first claimed the safe was unrecoverable. They claimed to have spent $500,000 searching the rubble with no success. Suddenly, when lawsuits threatened to punish them severely for this lack of success, they somehow found the safe. $500,000 worth of searching couldn't find the safe, but the threat of a lawsuit could. Jock's daughter, Thomasina, has told the press that the safe was delivered in a highly suspicious condition, in that the number was simply chalked on the front of it. This number did not match the number she had in her records. The bank claimed it matched her own number, but did not show any paper to prove that. Then the New York Times, in March 27, 2002, reported that although the safe was burned, but not terribly mangled, the door to the safe was open and there was no lock, only a round hole where the lock had been. Inside the safe, there was debris. This last fact is the most important, although it seems to be the least important. Negatives are made out of plastic, and the sleeves would either be paper or plastic. If the lock had been knocked out by the weight of a crash from above, allowing fire into the safe, then the fire would have burned away everything. Fire does not leave debris. It leaves smoke or ashes. In the case of the plastic, it would have left a black film as sort of a solid puddle on the bottom of the safe. With 40,000 frames of plastic, we would expect a very large puddle indeed. But Thomasina did not report ashes or any sort of plastic residue. She reported debris. Even if we imagine that the door may have been opened later by weight from above, and that the debris from beyond the fire blew in that way, we would then have both debris and ash. But we are supposed to believe that the debris got in and the ash got out, leaving a burned safe with no burned contents? The space through which the debris entered was small enough to allow in only a small amount of debris, but large enough to allow all of the original contents to escape? None of the debris was recognizable as the remains of the negatives, or Thomasina would have been able to recognize that as proof that this was the correct safe. In fact, a plastic residue from 40,000 negatives could not blow away or out of the safe, since it would be stuck to the bottom of the safe. Go burn a small amount of plastic in a pan and then see if you can blow the residue out of the pan. No. You will have to throw the pan out, since the plastic residue will have charred itself permanently into the bottom of the pan. It is much more likely that the debris was added later as a touch of reality by someone who was not highly trained in logic, or who did not know that negatives were made of plastic. Alternate theorists have used this new mystery to further bolster their ideas that the Kennedys are still being targeted by masked men, but the Kennedys themselves would find these negatives more useful than any outside conspirators. We should always suspect those who have the most to gain. Even without any mysteries or assassinations or faked deaths, the Kennedys would have the most use for pictures of themselves. And given whatever mystery in whatever form, the Kennedys would still have the most reason to want those negatives. Especially if they contain some evidence that could be used to prove they are still alive. They would want these photos suppressed, just like they still suppress photos on the internet. As you have seen, there are very few photos of the RFK assassination on the web. Most have been deleted. Am I through? Not even! JFK Jr. is said to have died in 1999. Let's look a bit more closely at that date. Is it a coincidence that all three Kennedys died on the eve of a presidential election? Jack died just before the 1964 election, Bobby was just before the 1968 election, and John was just before the 2000 election. How old would Bobby have been in 1999 if he had lived? 74. That in itself is highly suggestive, since 1999 would be the expected time for a prince to come to power. And that is just what happened. I propose that Bobby Kennedy died in hiding in 1999. Even those that may have followed me this far will balk at imagining that John Jr. could be responsible for 9/11 in the Iraq War, in the Military Tribunals Act, in the loss of habeas corpus and the Patriot Acts, and so on. But why balk at that? His father was never who you thought he was. Listen again to the entire shadow government speech to the press. His uncle was never who you thought he was. He used all that civil rights stuff just like Johnson did to get votes and make you think he was a great guy. It didn't work with Johnson. Why did it work with Bobby? Ask yourself that. If Johnson had been better looking, you would still love him too. You would just find excuses for him as well. And John Jr. was never who you thought he was. We are told that George Magazine was a progressive journal, but that is just hooey. It was a glossy, star-kissing piece of fluff with the required reactionary politics. The truth is that John Jr. was always just a dopey, rich, pretty boy who couldn't pass the bar and didn't know anything he wasn't told. He is now playing Commodus to his dad's Marcus Aurelius. To prove this, let us look once again at Jr.'s death. This time we have no photos and no film, but we do have a mass of anomalies and lies and impossibilities. We have a cover-up of something, and once again the most logical thing to assume, given the place and form and other players in the cover-up, is that the death was faked by the Kennedys themselves. I won't comb through the evidence here as I did with Jack and Bobby, but notice that JFK Jr. was supposedly cremated. Convenient, since it dodges any future disinterment. Even the ashes were buried at sea in a very unusual ceremony. Jr. was not a sailor and had never been in the Navy. It is as if the Kennedys were afraid the ashes might be DNA checked later, so we have both the cremation and the swallowing of them by the sea in a doubly careful effort to remove all evidence. Quick side note here, where did they throw Osama bin Laden when they killed him? They chucked him in the sea. Did they release any pictures of Osama bin Laden after he was killed? Not to my knowledge, they haven't. I've seen a few that bounce around the internet saying that it's him, but as far as I know, there's no official footage or evidence that Osama bin Laden was killed, or even alive at that point. But anyway, let's get back. Beyond this, it is curious, to say the least, that the Pentagon took control of the crash scene and all press relations from the beginning. Conspiracy theorists have taken this as proof that the government was involved in an assassination, but the government would also be involved in a fake death. We know we have to cover it up. But is the government covering up a murder, or is it covering up the lack of any bodies? If we were only seeing the cover-up of a murder here, there would be no reason to hide the body and then cremate it. If the fuel line was tampered with, for instance, then the government only needed to hide that fact. Hiding the body is unnecessary. It is even counterproductive since it causes suspicion. A government that had murdered JFK Jr. would be quick to show the body as proof he was dead. They would not be trying to hide that fact, but promote it. They would only be trying to hide the evidence of foul play. No, the logical reason to play cat and mouse with the body is because you don't really have a body. We see the same sort of games with Junior that we saw with Senior. Since we see very strange games being played with the body, we should begin our questioning by questioning whether there is a body. Beyond that, we have lots of other misdirection. On the web, we have several films proposing that the Bushes are responsible for the death of JFK Jr. Some propose that George Sr. did it, and others propose that George Jr. did it. These are prominent videos linked from 9/11 truth sites, so I have seen them and given them a fair look. These videos tell us that both Bushes were unaccounted for in the days surrounding the death, implying that they had no alibi or something like that. This is so ridiculous, it is difficult to imagine how it made it to publication. Are these documentarians suggesting that the Bushes were the actual triggermen or missile men? Or supposing that the plane was sabotaged, are we to imagine that one of the Bushes pulled the hose himself or cut the line himself? I think that if the Bushes had wanted to kill Junior, they could have hired somebody to do it. I hear they may have some money and connections. To call in a hit like that, you don't have to leave town for 3 days, travel across the country surreptitiously, cancel appointments, act like a spy, and call attention to yourself. All you have to do is make a phone call. I almost hate to spoil this for you, but even JFK Jr.'s saluting photo is purposefully misinterpreted. Look where the sun is in the picture. Jr. isn't saluting. He was just shading his eyes from the bright sun. If you watch the film of that moment, it is clear. Only in the still photos does he appear to be saluting. What about Teddy Kennedy? Was he, as youngest brother, left out? Or was he the senatorial liaison, the visible enforcer of the invisible mob boss, only pretending to be drunk and marginalized? Or was he in fact the king, hiding in plain sight? No, Bobby lived until 1999 and Teddy never got his turn. By the time Bobby died, Teddy was not interested in living underground. He wanted to live out his life in the Senate, doing nothing. But concerning Chappaquiddick, we have more clues. There, Teddy was the fall guy, covering for someone else. Remember that this was the summer of 1969, only a year after Bobby's fake death. Mary Jo Kopechne had been a campaign worker for Bobby and she was very attractive. Thin and blonde, just what Bobby liked. There is now a picture of her on the internet with Bobby and the Boiler Room Girls. The other young women look uncomfortable, but she looks very comfortable, even wifeish. What probably happened is that Mary Jo, after one too many gin and tonics at the party, threatened to tell the world the Kennedys were not dead, and that this was the one sin not pardoned. Bobby himself was present at the reunion party since this was Kennedy territory, very remote and protected. None of the others at the party have ever said a word, and this is hardly surprising since they didn't want to end up like Mary Jo. Mary Jo was killed for the same reason Marilyn Monroe was. She couldn't keep her mouth shut after the sex had ended and she was left to her pills and booze. Of course, there is also the possibility that they just relocated her. As JFK had wanted Mary Pinchet Meyer underground with him, maybe RFK wanted Mary Jo Kopechne underground with him. Teddy had nothing to do with the affair until they had to use his car. The ever-present spooks, CIA or Secret Service, did her in, but decided at the last minute to use the car as the cover. They were in a very remote area and didn't have a lot of choices in automobiles to drive into the lake. Since Mary Jo's hysteria was last minute, it is likely the murder and the cover-up were also last minute and not well thought out. At last, it was decided that Teddy should take the fall, since he was best able to take it. He had no real connections to Mary Jo, so none could ever be dredged up, no matter how much investigation there was. They only had to explain why his car was there, and they came up with a story that would do that, while making him seem like only a bumbler or a drunk. Of course, Teddy was never in the car, so he didn't have to swim out of it or any of that nonsense. The spooks drove it into the water, not Teddy. As a Kennedy, he was able to avoid the mandatory sentence for failing to report an accident, and the family never lost control of the story beyond that. There was probably no body and no murder anyway, so Teddy wasn't ever in danger. Mary Jo may still be alive to this day. In fact, if you do a search for her on the Social Security Death Index, you get nothing. According to the government records, no one by that name died in 1969 in Massachusetts. Teddy didn't bow out of the 1972 race due to Chappaquiddick. He bowed out because Bobby was afraid he would win, and Bobby didn't want the competition. Bobby preferred that Nixon win the election of 1972. Chappaquiddick was inconsequential, except as a way to sell papers. The press does not determine what these people do, they decide what the press will do. That was as true then as it is now. Teddy's liberal stances in the Senate don't really reflect his own opinions or those of the Kennedys. These stances are nothing more than poses. Notice, as an example, that although he has been in the Senate longer than anyone except Byrd, his liberal policies never amount to anything. This was as true during the Clinton years as during the Bush years. Curiously, none of Teddy's liberal policies ever come to fruition. He appears to be liberal, and he appears to be a complete failure. This is the perfect cover. A mole is always disguised as the polar opposite of what he is. According to the larger story I've been telling here about the Kennedys, that means that Teddy was most likely to be extremely powerful, extremely effective, and extremely conservative, to the point of fascism. After all, he is and has long been the eyes and ears of the Senate for the king. How liberal can the eyes and ears of a king be? Remember how Teddy ran for president again in 1980 against Jimmy Carter? Roger Mudd asked him why he wanted to be president. 30 seconds of silence. Does it take a psychologist to read that sign? Teddy had no answer because he knew he was never meant to be president. He was meant to play a part. The part of a liberal Democrat speaking for the urban black, the family farmer, the steel mill worker. But as Alexander Cockburn pointed out in 2009 in Teddy's obit, Kennedy never did anything for these people and did a lot against them. Want examples? Deregulation of trucking and aviation, which were terrible for labor. NAFTA and GATT were terrible for all American workers except for the bankers. And what about the hate crimes bill, which eviscerated the First Amendment? Like the other Kennedys, Teddy only posed as progressive, while promoting covert fascism all along. And now for the final turn of the screw. We have looked at all the important Kennedys of the second and third generation except one, Joseph Jr., Jack's older brother. He was the one that was supposed to become president first, we are told, but he died in 1944 in a military accident. Most people don't even know about him anymore, but it turns out that the accident in 1944 was just as fishy as all the others. First of all, once again, it was filmed. It was an airplane explosion, and a smaller aircraft just happened to be filming the whole thing. This film was not just good fortune, it was planned. The film crew was put into the air by the same people that put the bomber into the air. In other words, it was another Hollywood production, courtesy of Joseph Sr. and RKO Studios. Another curious thing is that no bodies were found. The explosion was so powerful that the bomber blew to smithereens, falling like confetti on the English houses below, we are told. Once again, we have to take their word for it that anyone died that day. Kennedy and the other men said to be on board were most likely never on board. It is admitted that the bomber was remote controlled, so no one really needed to be on board. They could have parachuted out at any time after takeoff, and the following camera crew only needed to pan away for a few seconds. If that is not suspicious, I don't know what would be. In fact, there was absolutely no reason for them to be on board. The only reason to claim that two people were on a remote-controlled bomber with a huge touchy payload is so that you could fake their deaths. I say touchy because Joe Jr. was supposedly warned that the bomb might accidentally go off. That is another huge red flag here. It was planted information so that people afterward would go, "Oh, well, he was warned." It was a big risk. He was riding dynamite. If you are planning a fake accident, the best thing you can do is make it look like the accident was not so unlikely. Then people are more likely to accept it, of course. Also ask yourself if the Army is going to put the son of one of the richest men in America in a high-risk situation like that? Joe Sr. was one of the 10 richest men in America at the time, and there is no chance that the Army is going to put his first son in a ridiculous position like that, much less let him volunteer for it. The history of the Army is one of magnificent blunders, but not of this sort. This is the one thing that the Army always gets right. It keeps rich boys out of absurd situations like this for obvious reasons. There was no reason for Joe Jr. to be on that plane and every reason for him not to be. Upper-class boys get put in risky situations occasionally, but only when there is the possibility of major glory. There was no possibility of glory or heroism here, only extremely high levels of unnecessary risk. There is no chance that the Army would have allowed Joe Jr. to actually be in that plane. They would only allow him to appear to be on that plane under orders from Joe Sr. himself. This is confirmed by Joe Jr.'s Army experience up to that point. His first assignment was in the Caribbean, and as we all know, that was not exactly the eye of the storm in World War II. He was then sent to England, but was ground-based, meaning, I suppose, that he was not assigned to a carrier. Instead, he was assigned to some of the least hazardous duty for pilots, flying submarine missions. Submarines could be attacked from high altitudes, using radar above their flak, and unless the submarine were surface, there would be no flak. As with John's missions, Joe's have been padded afterwards. But except for volunteering for the fake robot plane, Joe never did anything heroic. Joe received medals posthumously for his faked death, but he didn't receive any before that. He had been in England for less than a year, and we aren't told how many submarine missions he went on or how many kills he was involved in. John later claimed that some of Joe's co-pilots had died, but we aren't given any details. Like if they had been killed while he was also on board, or if they had died from food poisoning at base. If Joe had survived an attack while others died, it is likely he would have been decorated for it in some way. Another thing is fishy in Joe's bio. Wikipedia tells us that Joe Sr. had agreed to support FDR if FDR supported Joe Jr.'s run for governor of Massachusetts in 1942. Problem with that is that Jr. was only 26 in 1941 and hadn't even graduated from law school. We are told that Jr. dropped out of law school to go to war. Was he planning to drop out to run for governor? No, this story is planted to make us think that Sr. was supporting FDR around 1940, when the exact opposite is the truth. Sr. never liked the New Deal. All the rich guys hated it. FDR appointed him to various positions to keep him out of trouble. But when Sr. lost his post at the court of St. James, he was free to make trouble again, and he did. How, you ask? And why should he and Jr. fake Jr.'s death? To answer that, we have to go back to 1933 and the Morgan DuPont coup. This coup was thwarted by General Smedley Butler, but we have some curious facts that have come down to us. According to sworn testimony before Congress, the conspirators wanted to take over the government by a clandestine method. one which consisted of two main features. 1. FDR would be convinced to feign illness. His polio would allow him to do this easily, and the public would be easy to fool. To help him in his time of hardship, he would appoint a general secretary as a new post to the cabinet. This new post would function as an under-president or second president, with all the powers of the president except the title. If FDR did not agree to this plan, the general and his army of retired soldiers would take over by force. This history is well known, but commentators have mostly focused on the threat of physical violence. There has been almost no commentary on the rest. But it is the 2 points that make up the plan that should draw our attention. Again, number 1, feigning illness, and number 2, a second or shadow president. This is what happened in 1945, just 12 years later. We must remind ourselves that FDR was only 62 when he is said to have died. Yes, he looked bad at the end, but if you want to look bad, you can look bad. It is the easiest thing to do, especially when you are over 60. How FDR looked means nothing, since faking illness is done every day by grade schoolers. The conspirators of 1933 were right. It is easy to fool people on this matter. All you need is the desire to do it. That leaves us with the shadow president. In the decades since 1933, the rich guys like Morgan, DuPont, and Kennedy had changed the plan somewhat. Rather than install a shadow president, it would be much more clever and useful to install an invisible president. They would still have 2 presidents, a real one and a fake one, but this time the real one would be underground. An underground president is much better than a shadow president, since an underground president suffers no scrutiny and answers no questions. You don't have to buy the press in that case. You can just send it on a never-ending goose chase after the fake president. Another important thing had changed between 1933 and 1945. The families decided to place one of their own in the position of invisible president. In 1933, they were planning to put General Hugh Johnson in the position of assistant president. But by 1945, they had seen a better way. Put one or more of their own children in the position. Who would be this invisible president? Joseph Kennedy Jr. for one. He was young and strong and only recently deceased, so he was already invisible. All you have to do is install him behind Truman once you get rid of FDR. But how did they get to Truman, you ask? They didn't get to him. He was already their man. They installed him as vice president back when the 1944 ticket was being created. Truman was not FDR's choice, as is known. FDR hardly knew Truman. Truman was chosen by political bosses from New York, Chicago, and St. Louis, including the notorious Robert Hannigan and Edward Flynn. After the fall of Tom Pendergast, Hannigan was the most corrupt man in Missouri. So Truman was basically chosen by a group of political mobsters over the wishes of FDR. This is known, but the questioning always magically stops there. Political mobsters are not the top of the food chain. Politics is not an end, it is a means. Political mobsters get people elected for reasons, and these reasons are financial. So we should look for the robber barons pulling their strings. We look to J.P. Morgan, Pierre DuPont, and of course Joseph Kennedy Sr. Assuming Sr. wasn't already part of the coup in 1933, he was certain to have joined it after 1938, when his hatred of FDR reached new levels. What is more, we know he met with Truman in 1944 before the election. In this interview with Joseph Casey in 1967, Casey says, quote, Hannigan said he considered Joe Kennedy the most influential Irishman in the country, more influential than Jim Farley. And so Joe Kennedy was sent for, and he came up from the COD to see the candidate for Vice President Truman in 1944, so he was helpful in the election of Roosevelt in 1944, end quote. Let's look at this quote carefully. Joe didn't join the FDR campaign until Truman did. Apparently Joe was interested in getting Truman elected, but not FDR. Why? because it was already known that FDR would not be allowed to last 6 months into his 4th term, and that would make Truman president. If the plotters could get their man in as VP, half their job was done. He could be promised the post of fake president and all the glory and money of that, while their own man, Joe Jr., could be installed as the real president. Consider the 1948 election, in which Truman magically came from nowhere in the middle of the night, winning by a margin of 1,000 votes in 3 states: Ohio, Illinois, and California. Who could have pulled off a steal like that except the political mobsters Truman was associated with? Remember, Truman got his start with the biggest political mobster of the time, Tom Pendergast, then switched to the second biggest, Hannigan, when Pendergast hit the wall. Also remember that Truman's approval rating in 1948 was in the 30s. The Democratic Party was split 3 ways with Wallace and Thurmond, and then there were new Republican majorities in Congress, and Truman was neither smart nor charismatic. History has been rewritten to convince us that Truman electrified crowds on his whistle-stop tours, but that is just propaganda. Truman couldn't electrify a 15-watt light bulb. He had won his Senate seat not with electrifying speeches, but with ballot box stuffing, and he became vice president and president on FDR's coattails. Only fools would accept the proposition that his win in 1948 was an election upset or a triumph of the underdog. It was a masterful con of the public, not surpassed until 1963 and 2001. This makes Truman's "the buck stops here" one of the biggest hidden jokes in history. The first fake president of the US puts a sign on his desk that says, "The buck stops here." These guys do have a sense of humor, if nothing else. Also remember that the National Security Act had been put into place in 1947, near the end of Truman's first term. This was passed specifically to ensure Truman's re-election by installing a secret government headed by the newly created National Security Council and CIA, but with other secret committees beneath these. The National Security Act was sold as a post-war reshuffling and consolidation and streamlining of the various military departments, but that was just the frosting. More importantly, the act provided for the creation of real government agencies funded by real tax dollars so that the underground government could tap the treasury in a semi-legal fashion. The underground government could use federal tax dollars directly to steal elections, fight secret foreign wars, and run all sorts of clandestine operations, both foreign and domestic. They've been doing it ever since, as we now know from the various Watergate and Iran-Contra scandals that have surfaced over the decades. But primarily, the 1948 election had to be stolen to protect the underground president, and the Act of 1947 was instrumental in that. Without the Act, these elections had to be stolen with private money, but after 1947, they could underwrite all their crimes with federal money. From then on, the billionaire mobsters that had taken over the government were given an aura of respectability. They were now paid by the Treasury and didn't have to resort to other lower forms of theft and intimidation. For instance, the secret government probably could have bought out or intimidated Dewey like they had the rest, but it was so much more efficient not to have to deal with that. If you stole the election in a cunning enough manner, even your enemies might not suspect you. So the underground government had to be sure of Truman. They had to ensure his re-election. Secrecy was the first line of defense, and any change of teams would jeopardize that. You have to be sure of your man going in. The wealthy were sure of Eisenhower from the beginning, since they drafted him, and by 1960 the Kennedys had one of their own sons on the puppet throne as well. Which leaves only one hole to fill in this part of the story. Why the switch from Joe Jr. to Jack in 1963? I suggest Joe Jr. had been a hidden king for almost 20 years and was tired of it. He was now almost 50 and was tired of governing, even with his father's help. He was also tired of squabbling with his little brother. Joe Sr. discovered it was a mistake to have a son in both positions, king and president, which is why Bobby later demanded Teddy get out of the 1972 race. Finally, Joe Jr. bowed out and left the scepter to Jack. Joe retired and lived out his life in private. As you see, this was another benefit of being an underground king. Since you were neither a king by birth nor in the public eye, you could retire anytime you liked. Either that, or Joe died in 1963 from causes which are unknown to us.